I'm Mr. Pagliuca, and I'm here to present to you on a subject that I love and take the opportunity to share my enjoyment of learning about the hunter-gatherer lifestyle with you today. So I appreciate your teachers inviting me in. And so let's get started with this. Some of you might remember me from some videos in 5th grade. And so here we are. And in 3rd grade, you can think back to your 3rd grade teacher, and you actually studied Native Americans during that year. It was actually in the fall of that year of 3rd grade, and you studied glaciers, and you probably pushed ice over sand and saw how the sand stuck to the ice, sort of like the mountain tops and rocks of mountains stuck to the glaciers and then were pushed down to form Long Island and the glacial moraine at Hammonasset, as well as how Native Americans used the land in Connecticut, different rocks and so forth. We're going to get into that. Mr. Rankin and Mr. Knopf's at Lattle demonstration. You remember throwing the spears at the cardboard target and maybe even going on a field trip to the Pequot Museum. So we're now expanding your knowledge of that unit, and we're doing it through the inquiry question of how well did hunting and gathering meet the food needs of the native population. So we're asking, were Native Americans food insecure, which is a term that your teachers either have gone over with you or will be going over with you very, very soon. And there's a lot of different types of food insecurity. So there were 3 different ways, generally there were 3 different ways of producing food in human history. The first is hunting and gathering, which is what we're going to be discussing today. After you finish with your inquiry there, you're going to be taking a look at agriculture, which is farming and plowing fields, and then industrial farming using machines, drones, and genetically modifying plants and animals. Our question is well, what can we learn from each type? Like, what do we want to take with us from our study of each type? It's not really a question of what's best. It's more of a question of what can we take from it. So let's continue. And in today's presentation, we're going to study who were hunter-gatherers a little bit. What did they do? Where did they hunt and gather? When did they hunt and gather, and how? And then over here, before we get to this point, I wanted to just talk about some myths that I want to dispel in this presentation, and we'll return to this and see if I did in fact dispel the myths convincingly for you. One is that hunter-gatherers were less intelligent and somehow inferior to civilized people, which is really an offensive perspective in the first place. Also, it's misinformed. So we'll get this out of our heads. Another one is hunter-gatherers were always hungry. Hunter-gatherers were always on the move. It did not work for people, and the world was the same then as it is now. So we will take a look at these things throughout the presentation. So the first one we're going to take a look at is this intelligence question. And I would contend that these hunter-gatherers were amazingly intelligent because they were masters of botany, the study of plants, masters of biology, of living organisms, animals, fungus, insects, all of it. They were very good at astronomy and used it as navigation, geology, the properties of rocks, the location of rocks, ecology, the study of the Earth's systems, engineering, and medicine. Those are things that we'll be touching on very shortly. So they weren't even good at just one of these things. They were good at combining all of them. They were masters at all of these. And in many ways, our specialists today, they're like good at this, or they're good at that, or they're good at this, or they're good at that. But they were very good at all of them. And they had to be because their lives depended on it. So you'll see some examples of this in the coming slides. So if we take a look at plants, please remember that they're using plants not only to eat, of course, but also for tools. And they're also knowing where animals live and what plants the animals eat, and medicinal qualities of plants. So it's more than just eating, of course. But in terms of eating, you and I think of blueberries, raspberries, and strawberries and blackberries, but in reality, there's over 20 types of edible berries in Connecticut, and some of them are edible in winter, believe it or not. And but we just don't know, and we don't trust ourselves. So you and I have been largely taught that things in nature are poisonous and deadly. And if you don't know what you're doing, they certainly are. But that suggests to us that nothing is available in nature and we would be starving. Well, we would be, but they wouldn't be because they know all the different types of berries. I think there are over 16 different types of edible nuts available. Walnuts, for instance, the walnut trees have been killed off by a disease from Asia over the last 100 years, and walnuts were a major source of protein. But there's also ground nuts and many others that were available, and they would also ground the nuts into flour and make bread out of it and so forth. They also had corn, which was a vegetable that they could grow, as well as squash and beans, which are a great source of protein. And they also knew about tubers or roots that grow underground, and I'm going to show you one in a second. And mushrooms, we associate these as being very deadly, which they are, but only if you eat the wrong ones, and they knew the right ones to eat. And so they were really masters of the natural world. Let's take a look at the next slide. This is Jerusalem artichoke, also called a sunchoke, and these grow anywhere between 4 and 12 feet tall, and they peak around August, but they're edible right around now. So I'm going to give you a field trip video, and I'll harvest some Jerusalem artichokes out of the ground, and I'll send that video to you shortly. And Jerusalem artichoke is a tuber, or the root, and it's sort of like eating a radish or a potato or a carrot or a beet. These are all different forms of tubers, and we don't normally think of those as being edible. We are always thinking of like the fruit or the seed, something above ground, but a lot of things are edible underground as well, and they were masters at that. Here's another one. I have all of these in my yard. In my backyard, I call it my edible native plant museum. And this one is sassafras, easily identifiable by the mitten-shaped leaf. And then the trilobal leaf, deep lobes right here are very quick to identify. And then this is the third shaped leaf. And sassafras is used for swelling in the nose and throat, bronchitis, high blood pressure, arthritis, skin problems, and cancer. This is called anise hyssop. This is used for upset stomachs. It's a great pollinator. It spreads like crazy. It's a native plant. I have this in my yard as well, and it smells like licorice, and I think you can make a tea out of it, a licorice-flavored tea. Then, I already did that, and then we go down here, and this is called mandrake or mayapple, and this is the mayapple right here. This part's edible. This part's deadly. This is a great ground cover. And if you eat this part, which do not do, because I am not a naturalist and you shouldn't take any of this as fact, but the roots were used to cure jaundice, hepatitis, and fevers. And then I think this fruit also has additional medicinal properties, and this is called mayapple or mandrake. And I like the name mandrake because it reminds me of Harry Potter. Then we have a couple of others. This is called mullein. And this is used for whooping cough, bronchitis, hoarseness, earaches, flu, allergies, tonsillitis, sore throat. And these leaves were used for bandages. They had a healing property associated with the skin. And you've seen this on the side of the road if you ever take a look, and it can grow quite tall and often in bunches. And then this one is called milkweed. And if you pluck these leaves off, it lets out a sticky, milky material that really comes out. It's really interesting how milky it is. Butterflies love this, all sorts of pollinators. And if we take a look down here, milkweed is good for reducing swelling. If mothers can't produce milk, It's a medicine for blindness, relief for a sore throat. And modern day pharmaceutical companies who make our pills for us, they often go back to traditional medicines and figure out the plant that the medicines are derived from. And then they break the plant down into its ingredients, and that's where they get their inspiration for the different medicines that we take. So a lot of them are really taken from Native American medicine, even though we would be like, oh, modern science is so much better. Okay. Then, of course, a lot of you are familiar with elderberry. I have a couple of these in my yard. The birds love them, and we make a lot of jam out. Well, I have never made jam, but people make a lot of jam out of elderberry, and then people take it to support your immune system. It's very commonly taken for that. It's expensive too. Okay, animals. I don't know a ton about animals. I'm not a hunter, but they knew the migratory patterns of land animals such as deer and birds, of course, coming in the spring and in the fall. They knew the migratory patterns of fish that were going up the freshwater rivers and streams, as well as where shellfish could be found. And we'll get into this a little bit later. They also knew about animal parts for tools, and I have that example here. This is the ligament of like a deer, and they use this for hafting, which I'll show you in the next slide. So what they would do is they would wet that and stretch it out, and then they would wrap it around the antler or the wood or whatever it is that they use for a handle with the blade, the stone blade, and then when it dries really tight. And so this is called hafting. And here you see all sorts of different techniques where some of the handles were going through the tool, and then sometimes, like this one here, the arrow is split over the handle and then hafted there. And there's a lot of physics behind this as well, like where the energy is getting transferred from in the tool use. And they also would have known what type of wood, hardwood, softwood to use for the handles. So they might have used oak for if they needed strength, or they might have used cedar if they needed water resistance, or something with flexibility. They might have used arrow wood, which has a predictable use. And that's the next plant I'm going to buy, incidentally. And then there's geology. They knew all about rocks and the properties of rocks and what to use them for. And the only material in Connecticut available to make arrows out of is this material right here, which is called quartz. And this naturally creates sharp edges, but you could make a decent sized arrow out of a beautiful piece of quartz this size, and it holds an edge. And that's what you see on there are some quartz arrowheads. And a lot of times you can date the arrowheads judging by their shape. But they also made big bowls out of soapstone. And I went to Soapstone Mountain. I picked up a piece of soapstone and made this turtle. And I also made this soapstone ball. And it feels a little greasy like soap does, and it's one of the softest stones, so it's the easiest to carve. I used modern tools to do that, to make it easier, of course, and it was challenging in and of itself that way. They weren't limited to stone just in our area. These blade points, these are called blanks because they needed to be finished. The actual spear points would be smaller than this. These are about 4 inches tall. They look smaller in the picture. And these were found at the corner of Old Route 79 and Yankee Peddler. If any of you live in that area, right with that telephone pole at the corner. This is south of 95 in Madison, the highway. They found these 28 spear points, spear point blanks, I should call them. And it looks like they were between 3,000 and 4,000. Yeah, 3,000 and 5,000 years old. I can't quite read it, but you get the idea. And by people who were putting in a telephone pole for CL&P, which stands for Connecticut Light and Power. And this stone came from northern New York, I believe. And so They also found purple beads called wampum made on the Connecticut shore as far away as Michigan. So that tells archaeologists that the natives had extensive trade networks throughout really the modern day United States. They were so good. Some of their techniques were so good that they still use them today. And this CNN article talks about Stone Age blades made of obsidian are still used for eye surgery. And because they can't make artificial blades better than the way obsidian breaks. So that's really astounding. They really only use the blades once for eye surgery because that's how fine the blades have to be. And even just using them on this microsurgery within the eye, they can only use them once, and then they want another new blade. Ecology. They knew about the tidal patterns and the astronomical patterns and the migratory patterns of all sorts of living things. And an example of that is the shad bush, which I have in my backyard as well. And the fish wouldn't go up the freshwater rivers to lay their eggs until it got up to 60 or 62 degrees. So when was that the case? Well, they knew it when the shad bush bloomed in the spring. And when the shad bush bloomed, they would go down to the riverside and they would cast their nets, and they knew the shad were making their run up the river, and there would be literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of shad out in Long Island Sound waiting for the fresh water in the Connecticut River, the Hammonasset River, and so forth to make their migratory runs up the rivers. And they would count on that as a food source in the early spring. They also called this service berry, which is the European common name for the bush, because when they had weddings in the spring, this would be the only real flower that they have available to them for the wedding services. I have a shad bush in my yard. Oh, and that has edible berries as well, and I have eaten them before. Engineering, I already went over the hafting. That's sort of a design. And then there's fishing wares and animal traps and houses called weetus, which I don't think I'm going to cover here so much. But the fishing wares we can get into, and this is a fishing ware right here. You can see this long line of rocks. It's about a stone wall underwater, about 100 feet long, in a J hook. And they would, in the high tide, like you see here, they would stretch the net connecting the J probably right about here all the way to the end. And then in this next picture, when the tide goes out, the fish would get caught up in the net. And that's how they would do their fishing. And so this is about a 400-year-old Indian artifact right here at Hammonasset. And these used to be lining the Connecticut shoreline and up and down the rivers, but so many of them have been removed because of the modern boating. Like, boaters don't like to hit the rocks of these old fishing wares. Here's another type for engineering. This is a big V fishing trap, and they would have the nets in this area here, and then they would make noise in this area here and drive the fish into the V, and that's how they could collect in streams or rivers. And then this one is in Cape Cod, and I saw this, and the fish go in a big circle and a spiral, and the bait fish is in the middle, and they can't figure out how to make their way back out. And this water, depending on the tide, can be as little as 4 feet deep and probably considerably higher at high tide. But this is an example where nature does the work, and they just set it up. So I don't know whether you would call this hunting or gathering. It's sort of a combination of the two. But this is being done on Cape Cod today. And then how their world was different than our world. And it's important that we don't take our knowledge and then push it upon them as if it's true for their time. And we're really talking about hunting and gathering, 400 years ago to 12,000 years ago. And just because our world looks the way it does now doesn't mean that that's what it looked like to them. So we have to be careful about that. And before we form a judgment, we better make sure we have all the facts right. So for instance, this is what we normally think of the woods as being. And this is a picture that I took. It's very dense and hard to get into and so forth. But they used controlled burning in their woods which aided them in protection, but also in the ease of hunting and even gathering for that matter. And so this is really what the woods would have looked like, mostly in Connecticut, except for some swampland at the time through their use of controlled burning. So we're like, oh my gosh, I don't want to wander around and try to find food in here. But by and large, this is what it looked like. And then this article from The Guardian, humanity has wiped out 60% of animal population since 1970. So you can imagine just how rich and abundant nature was 500 years ago compared to 1970. And even in 1970, it was practically double what it is today. So we're like, oh wow, there's not a lot of nature around today. How did they ever do it? They must have been starving. Well, actually, their world was far more abundant, and they had rules about how much to take from nature. So if they had a stand of like 15 sassafras trees, they would only take, 6 or 7 in a given year to leave the other trees to propagate. And whereas we just wholesale like wage war on nature, wiping it clean. Another example is in this PBS article, The Race to Save Our Fisheries, and scientists concluded that 90% of large fish species in the world's ocean, like tuna, swordfish, and cod, have been fished out in just the last 50 years. That means that their fisheries were just not even comparable to the sparse amount of fish that we have available to us today. So it was just so much more abundant and, in a sense, that much easier to hunt and gather for food. So we shouldn't be like, we should be careful how we judge. And then it even affects our conception of gender roles. I bet most of you presumed that the men were the hunters and the women were the gatherers. But just this year, we found a skeleton. Archaeologists have found a skeleton of a 17 to 19-year-old female who was buried with a hunter's toolkit. And that suggests that women may have been doing the hunting as well, and probably men were doing some gathering. And this was in Peru, 9,000 years ago. So now archaeologists know to be on the lookout for this sort of thing. And maybe our gender roles are far more rigid today than they are actually to human history. These links, this one's from Forbes. It says that almost 3 billion birds have disappeared in North American skies in the last 50 years. And then this talks about climate change, also caused by our industrial, and this is from the LA Times, our industrial farming today. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in the sustainability of hunting and gathering. Now, granted, they had a smaller population, but they did have kids, of course, and they wanted to have kids and whatnot. But they just didn't have the massive population, unbridled population growth that we do. And they lived within their food producing means. So when we think back, we have proof that the Native Americans weren't food insecure, because when we look at the story of the first Thanksgiving, it's like, well, who was hoping who? It was the Native Americans teaching the colonists how to plant food and how to fertilize their fields and so forth. So clearly it was the colonists who actually had food insecurity, not the Native Americans. And actually one of the very first things that the colonists did was they stole food that was stored in pits on Cape Cod, and the colonists apologized for doing that. And then we ask ourselves, well, how long did hunter-gathering work for humanity? It suggests that it didn't work, and that's why they went to be civilized, but it's far more complicated than that. Hunting and gathering worked for 2 million years for human beings, because after all, we're here today. And at the end of this 2 million years, right here in this green spot, the world was in just as pristine condition as it was at the start of the 2 million years. Whereas we've only been farming, industrial or otherwise, in this yellow area, and we've already really made a mess of the world. Taking 90% of the sea life in the oceans, for instance, and what I said about the birds as well. Like, this is not a long-term viable system that we've got going on here. What would you be doing right now in a hunter-gatherer society? Well, you would be probably out there fishing and learning what types of fish go for what types of lures, at what types of depth, at what time of day. And that's how you would learn in a Native American, not a Native American, a hunter-gatherer society. And the reason I bring it up is because, in our society, for all of the awesomeness, supposedly, we have a lot of drug abuse and alcohol abuse, and we have a lot of stress and anxiety. And I think we can also take lessons from hunter-gatherer society about human happiness and taking care of each other. I don't, for all of our advancement, we have more, I contend we have more food insecurity than they did. So why aren't we able to use our advancement in technology to meet people's needs? Instead, we are depriving people's needs to some extent. And then I ask, how hard was hunting and gathering? Well, for one thing, I wanted to say it should be gathering and hunting, because I think they really received most of their calories from gathering, and then they supplemented it with hunting. So we should call it gatherer hunters. That's what I'm going to write an article about, I think. Who's doing the work to raise the plants and animals? Well, nature does the work. They just set the traps and let nature go to it. They know where nature has planted the plants, and then they go and they gather it when it's in time. And in that sense, it was a lot easier than insisting on farming and planting, plowing and seeding and irrigating and then harvesting and seeding. And oh my gosh, like, in some respects, farming is much harder. I'm not suggesting that any form of life here is easy. I'm just saying that a lot of people think hunter-gatherers were working their tails off on the knife edge of survival, when I don't think that was the case, and I think the evidence suggests otherwise. So what I love about the hunter-gatherer life way is that it was sustainable. It worked for 2 million years after all. It was healthy. Just take a look around at what people are eating for lunch today, and that should scare you enough. It was available to everyone. They really took care of one another, and it was environmentally sensitive. So I'll finish with this, but before I do, I want to go back up to the top and see if I dispelled those myths. So let's see. Hunter-gatherers were always hungry. I do believe I dispelled that. I showed you boatloads of types of food that they were eating. Just because we don't know how to eat in nature doesn't mean they didn't. They were always on the move. Well, really, I mentioned that they went from Hammonasset to Chatfield Hollow, essentially, moving twice a year. So I suggest that maybe it's us who are always on the move, not them, with our long commutes. Hunting and gathering didn't work for people. It worked for 2 million years. After all, we're here today. And the world was the same then as it is now, also a myth. Less intelligent? No way. These people, we're still trying to catch up with their understanding of how the world works. And if we can align ourselves with how the world works, I would be far more optimistic about our future. So I think I did a decent job, for being a novice as I am, about hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Then down here on our last slide, we'll finish with this. Bob Dylan is a famous songwriter. Maybe you've heard of him. And he had a lyric in a song that says, "Don't criticize what you can't understand." So maybe you can, for some closure for today, you can talk with your teacher about how this quote could apply to this presentation about hunter-gatherers. So I'm going to have some field trip videos where I go get some Jerusalem artichokes as well as some sassafras, and maybe I'll show you the milkweed that you can make the rope out of. And I can also share with you some links, one by Connecticut State Archaeologist, which is far more advanced than the presentation I showed you today. And maybe your teachers, if they want to invite me in, I can answer some questions for you, and I'd be happy to do that. I'll bring in my rocks that I showed you, and share a little bit about what I love about nature and the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I wish I could have been in your classrooms. And I trust that you are a very polite audience. So thank you very much. Have a good day.